Hi, Lois here from Grace Church Guildford. I wonder if you've ever had an encounter that has completely changed the way you live your life. Perhaps you visited an abattoir and then were left wanting to become a vegetarian, or maybe a health scare has caused you to take up a new sports hobby. Well, in today's video, we're looking at the resurrection of Jesus and how an encounter with the risen Lord Jesus radically transforms the lives of his closest followers, the disciples. So far in our videos, we've already looked at Jesus, the Son of God. Well, we had this stool as the illustration for what is Christianity, and Jesus, the Son of God, being the first leg. In the last video, you saw Jesus crucified on a cross, and today we have the resurrection, the third part of what is Christianity. Now, at this point in our story, Jesus has been in the tomb for 3 days. He was crucified on the Friday, then there was Saturday, and now on Sunday, his disciples are heading towards the tomb to prepare the body with spices. Jesus' burial had been rushed because he was crucified just before the Sabbath. And so his disciples are going there wholly and completely expecting to find his body. And that's in spite of the fact that Jesus has predicted many times that he is going to rise again after he's been crucified. Here's just one example of him doing that from Mark's Gospel and chapter 10. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We are going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man," that's him, "will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise." Despite Jesus having said this, from the reaction of the disciples, their complete bewilderment, we know that they weren't expecting to find the tomb empty. Some people argue that perhaps they just went to the wrong tomb and that's why they found it to be empty. But that doesn't hold up for 3 reasons. First, the authorities that had Jesus killed would have just produced the body later on, particularly when they wanted to squash Christianity. Secondly, the early church made no efforts to record where the empty tomb was. You can go to Israel now and have a tour, but the place that they'll take you to where they believe the tomb is at best a guess. They made no effort to record where the tomb was because why would they? It was empty. And thirdly, we can be sure that the tomb was empty because of what happens next in the gospel accounts of the resurrection. Jesus appears to his disciples. Here's one example from Luke's gospel. While they were still talking about this, that's the disciples, Jesus himself stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled and why do your doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. It is myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still don't believe it, because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish and he took it and ate it in their presence. Now you can imagine that after Jesus had left, the disciples were probably wondering, was this a dream? But they could look and see the fish that he had eaten and remind themselves, no, Jesus had been with them. Some argue that this was perhaps just a hallucination, but we know that 2 people do not ever dream the same thing, and so it is exactly the same with a hallucination. It's impossible for 2 people to hallucinate the same thing, let alone all of the disciples that were gathered together and saw the risen Lord Jesus. Later in some of the letters in the Bible, it records that Jesus appeared to 500 people. That many people do not have the same hallucination. So we've seen that the tomb was empty, but at this point you might be thinking, well, that all happened 2,000 years ago. What possible difference could that make for my life now? Well, at the start we talked about encounters that can radically change people's lives. And as we look at the radical change that the encounter with the risen Lord Jesus had upon the lives of the disciples, I hope that will provide you with the evidence for you to consider for yourself the implications of the resurrection, and if that is true, what difference that might make to your life. These disciples were ordinary people. Some fishermen, one a tax collector. They were not your big influencers of the day. If social media had been about back then, they would not have qualified for the blue tick. And prior to them meeting the risen Lord Jesus, we find them hidden away, cowering in a corner, absolutely terrified about what to do. Their leader for the last 3 years, they firmly believed was dead and buried in a tomb. And so they hide away from the authorities without a clue what to do next. They were complete cowards. And then something changes. Something that makes one of them willing to stand up and make a speech in front of 3,000 people. something that makes them willing to be martyred, one possibly crucified upside down, others stoned to death and beheaded. Collectively, their influence is known all over the world, and yet left to themselves, they are complete cowards, hiding away in a corner. The encounter that radically changed the lives of the disciples was that Jesus didn't stay dead. The tomb was empty. They encountered the risen Lord Jesus. And so that meant that everything he had predicted must be true. Everything that he had said over the last 3 years of them following him must be true. Everything that Jesus had said would happen at the cross. Their sins, what was keeping them from a relationship with God, had been forgiven, done away with. And so when Jesus appears to them and says, "Peace be with you," he meant it. Not a kind of peace that meant that the things that were making them afraid had gone. That wasn't the case. The authorities were still after them. But a greater peace had been achieved. That peace with God that can happen because of what Jesus had done on the cross was there for them. And so he could say, "Peace be with you." And so I have a question for you. What's your explanation for the resurrection? How can you account for the tomb being empty? If you can't reach any other conclusion than that Jesus did rise from the dead, then can I say that if that is true, then everything else that Jesus has said must be true. Everything else that we've looked at in the first 2 videos, that Jesus is the Son of God, that he did die on a cross, then these things must be true. You and I are in serious danger. We have rebelled against the God who made us. But the resurrection proves that Jesus is able to rescue us by what he achieved at the cross. And so that is the difference that the resurrection can make to your life 2,000 years later, a rescue by Jesus. Let me finish with these words from John's Gospel. Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?"